Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here. I was on parental leave last year, so I'm really like feeling back in many ways. So it's exciting to also be back in the Center for South Asian Studies community again after a while away. So I first want to start out thanking all of you for being here and for the invitation, and also thanking and recognizing my team members on this project. So I'm going to be talking about some oral histories, and I wanted to really thank the interviewees especially, as well as the team of sort of community-based folks who were involved in that project as well, and my great research collaborators here at Michigan. All right, so I'm just going to start out with something that might be obvious to everybody or might just be really review, but you know, one thing that I will, thank you so much, one thing that I will be a theme here is that linguists are often really behind when it comes to taking the sort of research and approaches from other fields as part of sort of theoretical approaches or explanations, especially social explanations for what's going on. So we're behind. And so one thing that I'm really excited about to talk to all of you is to really, you know, think about how, you know, so for me to really be able to incorporate theoretical approaches from other fields. So I'm just so we're all on the same page here. You know, so there's this idea of these three groups of people within the with South Asian heritage in the United States describing South Asian diaspora. So the first group is defined as who came here in the 1800s and early 1900s, indentured workers as farmers and settled in the west coast of the United States. And then there's the literature talks about these two groups post Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. And so one are, quote, skilled, and I'm putting that in quotes because we all know that like skilled is defined very opportunistically by governments, but workers that were defined as skilled by the US government, and you know, we can say like sort of white collar professional class workers, and then also families of those workers sponsored via family reunification. And so these folks were not necessarily and often not skilled from the perspective of the US government, but they often had caste and or other social privileges by way of they were skilled worker adjacent, right? So this is just like, you know, sort of the general one slide summary of South Asian diaspora in the United States, very broad. But today I'm going to be arguing for a fourth distinct group, and that's those who came concurrent with and after the IT boom of the 1990s and the establishment of the H-1B visa. And so this is something that has not been talked about by linguists, but it definitely might be something that's been talked about by sociologists or other folks who are really focusing on this area. And I'm going to discuss factors influencing language maintenance practices particular to Minnesota and Malayalam. And these are the first steps towards describing this linguistic community. And then I'll contextualize that with language practices in Kerala, and present some ongoing work. Hopefully there'll be some time to sort of talk about some exciting ongoing work that's attempting to generalize beyond Minnesota, looking at Malayali diaspora in North America more broadly. All right, so the sort of assumption to be challenged is one that, you know, is maybe quite obvious, but it's something that really isn't obvious from sort of a linguistic perspective. So cultural practices, including diasporic practices in communities, like so the sort of theoretical frames that we use to talk about this are often based on descriptions of diasporic communities from the mid-1800s and early 1900s. So those are sort of the frameworks and approaches we have to thinking about how language use looks in diasporic contexts. And so one thing I'm arguing for is we need to update that to sort of take into account things that have happened more recently and how people are using language now. And another assumption to be challenged is that treating the South Asian diaspora post-1965, and even within this one metro area in the United States, as a cohesive group is not a helpful analytic assumption. So that there's an assumption that that is going to work, and I'm saying I don't think that that's a helpful analytic assumption. All right. So like I said, these sort of conceptual contributions might be trivial for non-linguists, and they're definitely, when I talk about this with Malayalis in Minnesota and in Kerala, it's like sort of trivial because it's describing life, right? It's describing the reality. But like I said at the very beginning, this really speaks to a need within linguistics for more engagement with, these other fields to update our theoretical frames and assumptions. But really what I'm going to do a lot of today, just like more specifically, is describing this data set because I would really love if folks had questions or were interested in working on this data set, for example. I think it's really exciting and interesting for people who might be interested in a lot of different types of questions. And I have my own like linguistic questions, but there's a lot of other stuff there and it's available and here. So that's the other sort of selfish reason. So hopefully people are excited about that and want to think about it more. All right. So why Minnesota? Why Malayalam? So it's not just that because I grew up in Minnesota speaking Malayalam, although that is one of the reasons why I'm talking about this. But unlike other areas which have been studied by linguists, there was a relatively sparse South Asian community in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities area, which is where I'll be talking about mainly. And immigration really spiked during the late 1990s. And one thing that's really important is that attitudes about linguistic and other types of assimilation are not just potentially, we have pretty good evidence that they're really modulated by the degree to which one is a visible minority or the degree to which one really sticks out. And the degree to which South Asians and Malayalees in particular were visible minorities changed drastically during this time period, along with other things. And another thing that's really exciting about this community is that we can track the community from its founders. We know the first Malayalees who landed, like who came to Minnesota, and I got to talk to them, right? So like it's still sort of happening now. And two to three of the founding members of the community are among the interviewees here. So it's sort of a really exciting opportunity to study things that linguists care about in terms of like founder effects for like how what's the effect of the first founding community on language practices and cultural practices as a community progressed. And there's Minnesota, and that's Minneapolis. That's where that field site was. And one thing I want to talk about, because we're talking about Minneapolis, I want to give us a context of when this happened. So the final interviews that I did were conducted in January 2020. So I got it right under the wire. It was like my last in-person research data collection. And so I've talked to some people about the Minnesota Indian community's response to uprisings after the murder of George Floyd. It's like a very salient and important thing that happened like right after this. But that's not part of these interviews. So if you were like thinking about that, I'm sorry, I don't have like great analysis of that, but I can talk about that if you're interested in a more informal way. But topics having to do with racialization and anti-Black racism did, of course, come up because those are salient topics. All right. So just to give you a sense, it's like very rough, like, and you can see the y-axis isn't, or the x-axis isn't great here. This is not how I would typically, present data, but up there are, this is sort of a number of Indians in Minnesota starting from 1990, and the last data point I have here is in 2016. So you have a sense it's 0.5% of the total population of Minnesota. And then all we have is estimates of Malayali families in Minnesota, but we know in 1970 there were 8 families that were part of the community. So there might have been people who didn't talk to anybody else who was a Malayali, so we don't know about that, but we're talking about like people who are like, we are the Malayali community, that's how we're defining it. We have 8 families in 1970, and then estimates are about 500 families in 2018, and people sort of estimate maybe 1,500 Malayalis. And so I try to find more specific numbers, but was not really able to. So this sort of gives a sense of what this looks like over the time period we're talking about a little bit. All right, why Malayalam? So Malayalam is really interesting because, and this is really a big focus of my main area of research, is how language contact and change in Malayalam as it's spoken in India and Kerala, where Malayalam is mainly spoken. So this is an interesting case for things like language maintenance, or how people in English-dominant communities use their languages, because what's happening in Kerala and what's happening here in the United States parallel each other in some interesting ways. I'll talk about it more in a second in more detail, but basically it's interesting because of what's going on in Kerala. And so in Kerala, over the time that we're interested in, we have seen a bunch of things, including increased ubiquity of English medium education, increased use of English origin material in Malayalam, establishment of Malayali English and Indian Englishes as more central and used way more widely, and also establishment of emergence of a more stable middle class as compared to when the first Malayalis were coming to Minnesota in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And also Malayalam is relatively peripheral in the context of like South Asian diaspora studies. There isn't as much work on it, as you might imagine, given the fact that it's spoken by so many people and it's like a huge diasporic community. But I do want to highlight great work by Professor Sonia Thomas on that as well. Okay. Ooh. All right, and so here is Kerala, where Malayalam is spoken, and this little blip is where my fieldwork sites were when I did my dissertation research on Malayalam, just to give you a sense. All right, so the first set of data I'm going to be talking about is this Minnesota oral history project. So it's kind of interesting. I want to talk about sort of the methods and context of this. So what we have is we have different, we have oral histories, some that were collected by me and some that were collected in 1993 to 1988. That's like the first cohort, and then the second cohort in 2000 and 2001 by somebody who was really affiliated with the Minnesota History Center, a person by the name of Polly Sonifer. And so then my data collection was here in 2017 to 2020. And my project was in collaboration with the Minnesota Malayalees Association and the Minnesota History Center to document the Malayali community in Minnesota. And so we like wrote a grant to the legislature and sort of argued that this is a community that is interesting for various reasons. This was the first of these oral history projects. There's a ton of them. The Minnesota History Center, so if you're interested in this, a lot of them, they're publicly available, lots of different communities, really cool. But this was the first one to center around a community defined by language and not something else. So there are some that are defined by organizations in particular or defined by religious communities or things like that. So this is a little bit different in that way. And so if we're thinking about these different groups, right, who's represented, so whose experiences can we like talk about and compare? The first set of oral histories really were targeted at groups 2 and 3. So that's like the quote skilled workers and their family members. And I was interested in looking at this more recent group. So in my oral histories, we have sort of a combo of these two. So we have this sort of like group 4. I have to think of what a pithy name for that would be, right? That's what we have to do, but I'm calling them now like the post-IT workers at this point. All right. So just to give you, this is like a sense of like what the data is like and the structures and how it worked. So here the columns are, these different sets of interviews. And then here we have some info about it. So like I said, the first set of interviews, there were 12 of them. And so these were folks that happened to be Malayali that were part of other communities. So they were, these are the Malayalees that were part of like the India Association of Minnesota or other things. So they talked about being Malayali, of course, but that wasn't really the goal of that. And the person who interviewed them was an English speaker, so interviewed them in English. Recruitment was based on their roles in these community organizations. And the audio recordings and transcripts are publicly available. So if anyone's interested in this type of stuff, you can just find it and download it easily off the website. And then I did 2 sets. So the first set was not with the Minnesota History Center. And they were done by me, and I grew up in that community. So like that makes a big difference, right? If we're thinking about sort of methods and different interviewer effects and things like that, that's definitely relevant here. And don't have time to go into all that, but I have some points on that at the end. The languages that they were connected in were either English or Malayalam. And so I asked people like at the beginning, like what language would you like to do this in, and sort of gave them a choice. And then we just saw what happened. And because I'm interested in how people use language, like these languages together, that was very fun and exciting for me. So there's a lot of interesting data there. And a subset of these were based on this sort of official project with the Minnesota History Center and the Minnesota Malayalees Association who facilitated this. So they were the ones who did recruitment of participants, and I sort of gave them a list of like, all right, we want to make sure that we're really targeting folks that vary in these sort of generational dimensions, but also balanced by these cohorts of immigration, gender, religion, caste, occupation, things like that as much as we could. That was sort of targeted and tried to be balanced across groups. And the video and audio recordings of these, so now we have video, also are all publicly available now, thanks to a lot of effort by a lot of folks. All right, so, and I have I'm talking about a lot of things. I don't want to throw a bunch of data at you, but there's some nice quotes and stuff at the end if we have time to talk about that, but I'm just gonna give some summaries here of this. So in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, participants were asked about experiences with and involvement in their particular institution. And so one of these was, for example, one that was designed to foster community and aid language maintenance. The School of Indian Languages and Cultures, the name of it, SILC. As well as questions about general experiences of immigration and otherness. And so these were all folks who came to the US between 1959 and 1992, or the children of people who came at that time. And so here are some of the topics that were covered there that are relevant for our questions. In the 2019-2020s interview, so just from a methods perspective, I think it's interesting to think about, there were multiple groups with different interests that were involved in this project, right? So this is just, giving some context to doing community-based work. This is what happens a lot of the time, right? So we have the Minnesotan Malayalees Association who's involved and sort of as a go-between in many ways. And so their goals with doing this were to document the organization, so that was part of it, and also major events in the Malayali communities. That was very exciting for them. The Minnesota History Center, why did they have these oral histories to begin with? So they are interested in documenting the role of individuals and communities in the history of Minnesota. So they're interested in seeing, the history of Minnesota through the lenses of these different communities. And for me, I had a lot of different research goals. And so, one was sort of what I talked about already, which is documenting continuities and discontinuities across cohorts and groups, and in terms of relationship to community, identity construction, language ideologies, and practices, compared to counterparts that I had interviewed in Kerala, sort of age-matched in my dissertation work. I'm interested and was interested in influences of Indian Englishes and changing language ideologies in Minnesota and Kerala on language use. And also really ultimately to inform quantitative and experimental work on language contact and change. That's the very sort of most clear reason that I wanted to do this, is having some sort of qualitative work that can inform the quantitative work that is the main focus of what I do. So I'm not really trained as a qualitative researcher. That's something that I've come to later. And so here's just who we have. We have generations. So we have first generation. So I'm defining that as folks who immigrated to the United States. 1.5 folks who immigrated to the United States as children, and second generation. And so we have all of those for the pre-IT group, and you can see who the interviewees were. And the post-IT group, we also have those 3 generations. There's also is a third generation of Malayali Americans in Minnesota, but most of them were just turning 18. And so that is another exciting thing. And we've actually been able to target them with the survey work that I'm gonna talk about next at the end. All right, so here's just some things that were different about the groups, just some takeaways, all right? So in both groups, it was mainly Malayalis that were in their social circles, and part of this sort of makes sense if these were folks who were involved enough in the community to also want, volunteer to do this and be interested in this, right? So that's part of the sort of self-selection of that. And in both groups, they talked about, at this point, constant communication, at least daily, if not more, with family in India via Skype, WhatsApp, and other methods like that. So there's a lot of constant communication, which is very, very different. And that was one of the main things that people talked about in the earlier interviews, and when I talked to the pre-IT generation. That was a really central concern, was communicating with people back home, how to do that. And it's, it was one fun thing in the interviews is folks different estimates about how much it costs per minute to call India at that time. So there's a lot of great different estimates about that. All right, and so the other thing that I was especially really interested in is, in the post-IT generation, in the sort of more recent cohort of immigrants, there are a lot of active conversations within families, within couples, about efforts to maintain Malayalam and really shifting ideas about bilingualism. This really contrasts with the earlier group who were really worried about their kids learning English. They were also told in some cases externally by doctors and teachers, as happened when I was a kid too, not to speak Malayalam to your kid because it's gonna ruin their English, right? So that was really a big narrative, a dominant narrative that really influenced people's language practices. And that really was almost absent in this new cohort of folks. And it was just not relevant at all. One really important thing as well with that more recent cohort is folks are coming to the US with Indian English as one of their main languages that they use, or a variety of Indian English. So folks are not coming to the US, they're coming to the US with a variety of English that is their own, that they have ownership over, which is also very different from the stories that we heard in the earlier generations of people were, using English a lot in school. It was not that people weren't proficient in English, but that wasn't a language that was tied to their identity in the same way. And there was a lot of talk then about learning how to sound Minnesotan in one's English, which was very rarely an anxiety in the more recent groups. They were like, this is my English. I'm not stressed about it. I don't have anxiety about it. In the newer cohort, we have families that are professionals. Parents might have been professionals. And so a lot of cases, there really isn't this sort of thing of family reunification. And there's, at that time, also political reasons for that made it harder and harder. So that was right during the Trump administration when that family reunification was really targeted. But it's not just for that. Really, that's not the main reason that people talked about. It's because they were coming from middle-class families in India. And so there wasn't the same sort of pressure or economic motivation to bring siblings to the United States from this group, right? That's not true of all Malayalis or all South Asian immigrants, of course, but that's the case for this sort of professional class group. And so that really speaks to the degree of what type of context you have to be in to sort of even make it to be an IT worker, right, in the United States. And these folks came to Minnesota to work at large companies almost uniformly, or their partners did, as opposed to, for family reunification reasons, student visas, nursing, and missionary work, which were hugely represented in the earlier cohort. And one thing I wanted to say is, right, we didn't target people based on if they were IT workers or not. We targeted people based on when they immigrated to the US, and we wanted to get a varying sense of professions. But even then, there were big sort of qualitative differences, which make sense based on why people were immigrating to Minnesota in the 1990s to begin with. All right. And so that's the first generation, that's the folks that came to the US, right? And so now folks that have grown up in the US whose parents belong to either one group or the other, all right? So that's sort of who we're talking about here. And so a lot of the talk in the in the earlier groups with the second generation Malayali Minnesotans was about being a demographic anomaly in many ways across many different dimensions. This was not something that was as relevant. And I asked about those things directly, and people were not, that was not really as part of the self-narrative in this case for those second cohort, second generation students. Or not, well, I guess they were students, but young people. In the earlier group, there was a lot of reports of being racially miscategorized and receiving all kinds of different racial slurs, and that was not something that happened in the second cohort. Which sort of makes sense, speaking to the increased ubiquity and people sort of knowing more about what South Asian is. They report positive influence of older second generation role models, lots of positive attitudes about identity and language and cultural maintenance. Of course, this also is part of this group, right? If they're participating in this interview, that probably means that they have some interest in that. So that's something that we have to take into account. A lot more socialization with Malayalis. What that looks like is a lot more outside of family units. And so that's because there was less extended family in Minnesota because of this reduced role of family reunification. Whereas the earlier groups, a lot of folks were like, oh yeah, first of all, also people were having more siblings and kids back then in India. So like, oh yeah, I brought my 7 brothers and sisters here to Minnesota and their kids and their kids' kids, and that's like a big part of how we socialize. So that was a dominant narrative in that older group, not so much dominant in this group. That's not relevant for multiple reasons. Lots of positive attitudes about bilingualism. People like really sort of like these young people really excited about using Malayalam or trying to maintain it, and even if they don't use it all the time, that's something that they feel positive affect towards. And they often constantly connect with cousins and family in Kerala and other diaspora via social media, and that's something that's very natural to do. That's not the case for this older group. And so some of this stuff, so I'm going to talk a little bit about language use in Kerala. This is like the paper about it that has like a lot of details. I don't want to go into like the linguistic details, but I just want to give you a sense of what's happening in Kerala that I find interesting that might be interesting to you. So there's a lot of effects of English on Malayalam across all levels of the language. And so some sort of things that I think are helpful to illustrate what this looks like. So one is, so there's a paper on this by an anthropologist that was written in 1977 on the use of English in Malayalam back then. It's very fascinating. And so that paper describes lexical borrowing of words from English into Malayalam across education levels in rural areas and villages. So these sort of traditional way that we think of like how is English coming into this language, it's not through schooling, that's one of the things, but there's also just other things going on. And also the role of colonialism is also not actually direct in this case either. So a lot of this happened after colonialism. And then in 2016 in Kerala, there was a TV game show to see how long people can speak using only Malayalam without using English words. Okay, and that was like, when I was doing my research in 2016, people were like, it's so hard, it's so crazy, like it's not possible, right? And so I'm gonna talk a little bit about this more. There's also things like, this is like some people talked about this, like where, you have an English version of a word and a Malayalam version of a word. And so in some cases you can sort of use them interchangeably, but in other cases it's like, well, kinnam, which is like, that's like the Malayalam origin word, that means the large plate, and a plate or a plate is the small plate. Not everyone thinks that there's variation in that, but these words, these English origin words are so integrated in the language that they've really found their own niche, and that's something that is really relevant from sort of a linguistic perspective. And then we have all of these, so I have some data just like that's from WhatsApp, some like nice language data, but we have like all these sort of mixings of Malayalam and English within the same word. Some of these are like in headlines in newspapers, some of these are just natural like language use, some of these are constructions that have been used really commonly, like everyone says this, like my grandma said this when she was growing up. And so these are things that are sort of more or less systematic, but like very pervasive. So these are things that linguists really care about and find really fascinating, because like that doesn't often happen. This type of mixing is not really common outside of certain specific contexts of language contact. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit quickly about some data from language attitude or ideology interviews that I did with folks. And so this is like, so I'm zooming in on where, like, and I know we have some Malayalees here, this is where, these are the 3 main sites where where my participants came from for this. And this is really close to each other. So it's zoomed in, I forget, it's only like 15 kilometers square distance or something. So like this is like one region for sure. And so we had 112 participants. So they also, my main thing there was like to do experiments. So I was like having people like rate sentences and choose what sentence sounds good and all these other things. Like that was sort of the main thing. But I did these interviews to figure out what was going on with language contact, but also to use as sort of predictors of linguistic behavior. So, just to give you a sense of like what I was thinking about going in was like, what are people's ideologies and experience with English, and how does that affect their behavior in like other areas of the grammar? All right, but here is some data from that sort of matches, or just to give you a sense of contextualizing what's going on with folks in Kerala versus what's going on folks in Minnesota that I was just talking about. So if we're thinking about that post-IT and pre-IT cohort, we have these 2 groups are roughly age matched in Kerala with folks in Minnesota, right? So I asked people, what's a language that you're most comfortable writing in? Like if you're writing like a grocery list, like not like, but if you're just like writing a note to yourself, all right? And so this is just, we had people who were younger, people who were older, and we really see like, English, Malayalam and English. I mean, it's not that people aren't comfortable writing in Malayalam, but like there's, this is a strong preference. These are all folks who spent their whole lives in Kerala, grew up in Kerala, were educated in Kerala. Do you have a question?
Is this the script or the word they used?
That is a really good question, and that is really complicated because it's part of the whole. Do I have a slide about this? I think I do. Part of the whole question is what counts as Malayalam, and that is a complicated issue, right? But I just said in Malayalam and let them decide what that meant to them. Yeah, but very good question. And I also specified handwriting because some people, if you're typing, that was one. And now there's Malayalam keyboards and stuff that are ubiquitous, but that was sort of an issue, a bottleneck earlier on. But this was if you're just sort of writing down a list. And we see that there's a difference when we look at folks that would be roughly age matched to the pre-IT cohort, right? And then similarly, so if we have these like sort of two groups, if we ask what's the medium of school instruction that you received, about a third of the younger folks were educated in English immersion schools, and that's not the case, right? And so one thing, this is really tied to the ITs and H-1B issue like directly because that was the reason why English immersion schools and sort of English language training and all these different things exploded during this time and during the time of these folks' lifetimes, right? So that's something that like there is a causal relationship there, like that's sort of stated. But yeah, so right, we see this difference here as well. And this is an attitudinal question. So I asked people, do you mix in English when you're speaking Malayalam, right? So like, there was a lot of questions about that, but the first question I asked was like, do you do this, And so nobody who was younger said no, right? Some people here said no, but all of them did. So everyone does, but like I said, it really depends on what you define as English and Malayalam, which is a really exciting for me theoretical question. Right, but this is sort of getting at that ideology around it and how people feel about that too. So that was the next thing that I asked. So at the very end, I asked, what do you think about the future of Malayalam? Like very sort of broadly, I didn't mention English. And these are some translated quotes from people. So people said things like Malayalam status is going down and English is going up. People are not speaking English or Malayalam. They're not encouraging Malayalam in their children. So these are people that are growing up, spend their whole lifetime in Kerala. Their kids grow up and spent their whole lifetime in Kerala, right? So like these are the types of phrases that you might hear people who are living in diasporic communities use, or in other cases, not in a case where this is a language that's an official language spoken by 35 million people in like a major state, right? So this is something that, again, people who have experience with this language and being in Kerala might not be surprised by that, but that is often surprising to linguists who study this type of thing. There's issues about, or questions about revitalizing the language. Of course, there's also some standard language ideology in there, so people are like worried about revitalizing like the good version of the language, whatever that means, and there's a lot of things baked in there, but this sort of influence of English is part of that. There's this, young people don't even know how to read or write Malayalam, like, which is like, unfounded in many ways, but again, represents this ideology. And these sort of like lamenting pure Malayalam. You might see some of those issue, like sort of contexts in North America about English as well, but it is something that is notable. And it wasn't all negative. And so this, people, so this is sort of in 2016, right? So this is, again, translated quotes from my interviews. People are saying, yeah, using English is necessary. I try to avoid it, but it's not practical. English is part of Malayalam. I don't worry about using English. The standard way to speak Malayalam is to use English with Malayalam, and so on and so forth. So like there's also sort of more positive or neutral ideas about, what English is doing in Malayalam as well. And I want to go back. This is a really long quote, but like, it's just very interesting. So like this paper from 1977, some anthropologist came to study matrilineal societies in Kerala because that's what everyone does. And then she was like, oh wait, what's happening with English here? This is really strange. And then so she wrote a paper about it just because she was so shocked by what she saw. But what she said was, stuff that really aligns with what people in 2016 were saying. So there's continuities across this time as well. And so this idea of what's an ideal conversationalist is something that linguistic anthropologists talk about a lot. So it's like, a nice, sort of definition of what this means in this context. And so what she said was, the ideal conversationalist should not make a laborious attempt to bring in a Malayalam word, and should just use an English word. So it's like, why use a Malayalam word when an English word would do? Is sort of like, that was one of the heuristics that she got from her work and interviewing people about this. And so, just thinking about what this does or gives us, sort of as linguists, or when you think about how language use works, there's this idea about how do we define if something is borrowed into the language, or if it's sort of language mixing, right? That's a thing that some people really care about and are worried about in linguistics. As you can tell by my dismissive attitude, I don't care about that. I don't think that's a useful question. But working in this area on this topic really showed me that I don't think it's a useful question. So the traditional way of thinking about it is, well, find a monolingual. If the monolingual is using it, then that's it. But what does monolingualism really mean? And so the other thing is, if speakers don't notice that it's from another language, then it's part of that language, right? So these are the sort of heuristics based on other types of language context situations. But challenges for Malayalam are, what does it mean to be a monolingual in Malayalam? I don't know. I've never really met a monolingual in any language, I don't think. So that's sort of that's another thing that I think we need to think about. But also speakers' experience with these source languages, right? So Malayalees can identify that something is of English origin or not because they'll have experience with that. But they still view these words as part of their language, right? So it's like, I'm specifically categorizing this as, I know this is an English word, but it's also Malayalam. And that's fine. That's not a problem from the language user's perspective. It then can be a problem from an analyst's perspective if you're trying to make big boundaries between what counts as Malayalam and what doesn't. So that was, anyway, okay, so this is what we have in Kerala, right? So we have this idea, this big picture of what's happening in Kerala. If you remember what we talked about with these two different groups in the United States. And so this is sort of thinking about what are the traditional ways of thinking about language use and maintenance in diasporic communities, right? So I don't know if this is a very clear thing. I like making visualizations. This might not be clear, but if we think about, we have sort of these two generations. And so what do we do when we study diasporic language use? As linguists, what we do is we have these comparison groups, right? So you're like, well, we have the in situ population. And so there's the generation one, first they were, at time one, they were in situ, and then we have the in situ in the diaspora group, and we can sort of compare them. They're same cohort, things like that. And then there should be some sort of difference or distance, right? So in the traditional ways of thinking about this, it's you have the diasporic population, and then there's its own patterns of language use and change and conventions that happen there. And those are sort of separate. And then if we're looking at what happens with the second generation, we have this sort of okay, what's happening with language change in the second generation in the in situ population? We can compare that. And we can compare the age match groups of people who are in the sort of other, the majority community. So other Minnesotans in other Minnesotans as compared to that. All right, so that's sort of the traditional model. And then there's, what we see here is something that this student Anusha Anand called technologically assisted cohesion, but it's also probably something that people who study communication know about more than I do. But basically, instead of things being further and going further and further away, that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing actually cohesion across these groups. And in fact, if we look at this pre-IT first generation, that traditional model is really disrupted, right? So we have this idea of we have the diasporic community, and then they get more and more and more different from the in situ community. But what we saw is there's a period like where there was, sort of separation, and now cohesion happening again, right? So it's a really interesting, it's a really interesting model. We can make different predictions about what we might see in terms of language use and change, but it hasn't really, this type of thing hasn't been described in other communities, I don't think. So what are the predictions is something that, I have a lot of thoughts on, but we need to think more about it. All right, so, just to sum up this part, right, so we have this factors supporting use of Malayalam in the 1990s. We have this large Malayali community now, positive attitudes about bilingualism, middle-class resources, family in India can afford to visit. That's really common. That was not as common in the pre-IT group. Professional class salaries allow for regular visits back. Also, that was not common in the pre-IT group. We have this constant communication, and we don't have this split in the same way. And this idea about hybrid Malayalam, right? So we have something that's really interesting here where this post-IT first generation uses Indian English. Pre-IT group often learned spoken English in the United States. So even though people came in really proficient in English, a lot of the times, spoken English was only acquired in the United States. So there's really different Englishes happening here. The post-IT first generation produces more English origin elements in speaking Malayalam than the pre-IT group does. And it's not really seen based on what people say statedly as a threat to identity loss, and it's more reflective of how their non-diasporic counterparts, like their siblings who live in Kerala, use Malayalam, right? It's just, that's normal. And so more systematic analysis of this is ongoing at some point. And really crucially, personal choice and also interviewer effects is a big part of this too. So, right, some people knew me that were part of this, and that makes a difference. Okay, so really quickly, I want to talk about this ongoing project. So this is with Professor Maya Abtahian at the University of Rochester. And so we're really interested in this idea of the second and third generation. They talked a lot about this South Asian or Deshi identity. And if we look at sort of marriage patterns or preferences or social preferences, we also see this as well in the oral histories. And so we were really curious about what this means for if there's going to be a South Asian variety of English. This is something that people are interested in, study varieties of English, but also what does this mean for cultural practices? And so we did this big online survey, about 148 respondents. There were 3 parts. One was language background, so experience with and use of Malayalam, media preferences, consumptions, things like that. Then we had ethnic orientation questions, so the use or alignment with different identity terms, like Deshi, Malayali, South Asian, things like that. Participation in different spaces. And also we were curious about the outcome variables. It was fun for people. It's what word do you want to use for food? If there's we give people foods, we give them options. What word do you use for this? All right. So this is my I'm actually wanting to do this type of work. So we, this idea of comparing diaspora and in situ as 2 different categories has really been deconstructed. And so we did this is a paper with some students on looking at this of 6 to 7 Hindi Urdu speakers who are located in South Asia and North America. So we asked them to answer all these questions about their language background and use. And then we also knew where they were located and if they were sort of in South Asia and grew up in South Asia, if they were in the United States but grew up in South Asia, or if they grew up in the United States and stayed in the United States. And we found that actually, that sort of diasporic identity was not a clear predictor of language use and experience. And there were actually a lot more similarities across groups than we would think. So this really deconstructed that idea, and the point here is we want to match these analytic tools with theoretical assumptions based on qualitative work. So that's what we are going to do with the Malayalam data as well. But here's some quick preliminary results. So the first thing is, people are shifting language use. So 81% report speaking Malayalam with their grandparents, about half use Malayalam with their parents, and fewer use Malayalam with children in their family or their own children, right? So this is sort of a classic, that is something where the sort of models from the 1800s can sort of be applied still today in some sense. That's a classic 3-generation rule of language maintenance. But yeah, so I'm gonna give you some of these examples, right? So we had these pictures, and then it was like, what word would you use for this? Like click, so, and what we did was we had words that were Malayalam origin. We had words that were sort of like Hindi, Urdu, or like perceived North Indian, like that's sort of from the South Indian perspective, that's like what it feels like to people, so like we use those words. And then English origin words as well. Okay, so here's, and we had words varied as to how tied to being South Asian or Malayali they were. So in terms of so like water, we didn't think would like be especially like Indian or South Asian or especially Malayali, it's water. And so we had Malayalam origin, I already said that part, all right. But then we also asked about all the words that they might use and then asked them also to select which is their default or preferred term, all right? And so this is one where like I was very different from everybody else. Everyone picked achar, which is like, almost everyone picked achar, and I was like, what? I never say that. Anyway, so there was very interesting patterns. And words were also varied as to how they've been taking up in Anglo spaces. So there's a lot of diasporic commentary on like chai tea, that's like, people like love like ragging on that, right? And there's like all these like, well, you should never use the phrase chai tea. And people not of South Asian origin are saying, don't use chai tea, right? So this is something that's like a very like meta-pragmatically salient is what we would say, sort of from the linguistic perspective. There's like a lot of people talking about it. And crucially, so chicken curry is like the most like very Kerala thing. And so crucially, the origin of these words like sometimes don't match how they're categorized by language users, which you might have predicted, right? So chicken curry is like an English origin one, right? So if we're thinking of these three things, but many Malayalis in Kerala use it interchangeably with the Malayalam origin one. And it's not labeled as being English for many users, right? So this is something where we have to adjust our analyses accordingly. We can't just assume because the origin is X, like that's how users themselves are categorizing it. So this is like a great example of that. Like everybody said chicken curry, yeah. And so, there's really interesting idiosyncrasies based on food. But preliminary indications, seems like that there's these sort of three categories or like idealized sort of, profiles that participants were aligning to with or resisting, right? So one is sort of this general white Anglo-US identity, so resisting that with the chai tea thing. There's also this idea of like a general South Asian identity that some people were really identifying with and some people were really resisting. Like everyone thinks that, India is all Bollywood and like Hindi and things like that, and I'm not like that, right? So there's this sort of like resistance of that because of, sort of the homogenization of belonging to a diasporic community, right? And there's also the specific Malayali caste or religion-based identities as well that people were really sort of, in some cases, identifying with and also wanting to step away from. So final upshots. So what we really see is that we have this sort of positive attitudes about multilingualism, an established community, Indian Englishes as being part of a home language or like one's own repertoire, and more easy connections to family and friends really distinguish the experiences of post-IT Malayalis living in Minnesota from those who immigrated before, and what I would say is a qualitative way. As someone who really prefers quantitative differences to qualitative ones, that really, I do think there's a qualitative difference here. But we can't interpret any of this without reference to the social and linguistic shifts in Kerala. And this isn't because we want to see like, oh, how different are they from people in Kerala, but because the social networks and context of use is blurred. So figuring out what's happening there really helps us understand what's happening here because this is what's happening. It's not like this, all right. And sort of from a methodological standpoint, qualitative community-based work that is meaningfully informed by approaches and frames across disciplines is really necessary to do the kind of large-scale quantitative work that I'm excited about doing as well. And there's also a bunch of other things that like couldn't even talk about, right? But like just things that people might be interested in that really isn't specifically, about language stuff. So that's why I was like, here's a menu if anybody's interested in something, wants to work on something. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this community. That is that. Thank you so much. And I want to thank again all the participants of all these studies and my collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a terrific talk.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that fantastic talk. You have a ready-made interviewee here if you need. As you said, there are Malayalis in the room.
I know. Yeah. Yeah.
But I want to point
You
out
can talk away.
something I thought really fundamental to the notion of diaspora. Since
Yeah.
you said you were coming at it from a linguistic angle, I come at diaspora studies from a cultural and literary studies angle.
Thank you.
Um,
Very exciting.
And one of the things about Malayalis in India is that it's a very mobile group.
Yes.
So there is movement. When you talk about in Kerala, really, Malayalis are all over India. I don't know if you've heard that joke that we grew up with.
That's right.
That when the first man on the moon reached there was a
Yep.
Malayali with a chai
There
kada
was a chai
already.
cutter right there. Yeah. Yep.
So it's important, I think, to realize
Yes.
the other Indian languages and their influence on Malayalam.
Yes.
So there's so many contexts to diaspora.
Yes.
It's not just the simple movement of Malayalis from Kerala to parts of the
Yes.
US. It's also, for instance, the rural and the urban divide. It's the generational divide. So, and of course, this is, I am not someone who does social science analysis and methodologies and stuff. So this is clearly personal. But generationally, for instance, those, the younger generation tended to go to convent schools when they left Kerala.
That's right.
And other languages were forbidden. So everyone grew up speaking English to each other. And so the parents who spoke flawless Malayalam were forced to engage in English if they wanted to communicate with the younger generation.
Yes.
They were in another state, so they had to have that other language. And yet when they spoke to each other, I don't remember them using words from other languages. There were people who were monolingual when they spoke to each other. That changed in the younger generations. So I'm just saying that, this whole question of what Malayalis are and,
Yes.
where one speaks the language and how there are so many aspects to it that, add so much more to your already fascinating topic. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, that's absolutely the ideologies around language mixing have shifted despite this study from the 70s that were like, oh yeah, everyone's using this. I completely, yes, both with what participants were saying, even when I interviewed them in that one tiny context in Kerala, and also through other sort of, cultural artifacts, we really do see a difference in how much mixing is happening and what that looks like over this time, absolutely. And the other thing that did come up, and this was sort of an idea I had before COVID happened, was looking at these diasporas in other parts of India. And that's something that people in Kerala and people in Minnesota talked about, which is it's funny, my nieces and nephews in Bangalore, they speak less Malayalam than my kids in Minnesota. So there's these also different, anyway, there's a lot of interesting things going on there with also language policy and the sort of thing of, anyway, there's a lot there. So thank you so much for that. And I absolutely agree with you. We cannot think of Malayalam as one thing. And so that's one thing in that paper that I sort of briefly talked about. There's a lot of other, it's about non-Dravidian things in Malayalam broadly. So looking at other also words, because Malayalam is a contact language, like all languages, but especially, right? And we really do see obvious influence from so many languages across time because of its location and all these other things. Yeah, so thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a visual artist, so thanks. I feel home. I'm from Kerala. I'm Malayali. So a few things I missed is I was thinking you will mention the word Mallu.
Yeah.
You always say Mallu. So interesting part in Kerala is the education system. I'm saying because we have every villages we have libraries, right? So we have English to Malayalam translation, Malayalam to English. So the awareness, right, of normal kids around, right? We go there and we read. Such things happen. So what I'm trying to say is the knowledge about, wider knowledge about the world and, history, literature and everything. It's much more interesting in that way. Even in film field and everything, right? Like you can see Malayali names. And whenever, like if you go to North, if there is a group of friends, there will be always a Malayali there, kind of stuff. And one more thing, I was like really, you were mentioning about all this thing, skilled person. Like I came here with fiancé visa. I don't know which category I'm going to be in. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, that is important. That's also, don't want to essentialize that post-1990s group at all. So thank you for that too. And one thing that I didn't talk about enough, and that's really important to this, right? This idea of what happened in Kerala and why that matters is the political situation there is really why, like, how English is so ubiquitous. There's like the political and all those policies, all of that stuff is super important to this. Also to the use of English. That's a huge part of using English as well. So there's a long tradition, and many of you may know about this, right, in South India especially, of English as an anti-casteist and anti-oppression like tool for that, right? And so that is something that people very much inhabit, and that is very important and talked about and all of that. So it's not just like people are using this language because it's there and available, but it's also, part of like political agency as well. And so all of that is super important to this. So it's both about affecting the opportunity or the access to the language, but also motivation for using the language as well. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. I grew up in Dubuque, Iowa.
Oh, yeah?
But I have friends and colleagues that I've worked with in what was then called Trivandrum.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it gives you the time frame.
Yes.
To what extent might the view of English origin words being Malayali also be based on how long that borrowing has been going on? Because some of my colleagues re-immigrated back to Kerala from Malaysia, always kept Malayalam as first language, but they also said the Queen's English was also their first language. And so that borrowing had gone on even in a time period before the ones in your studies, but I didn't know if in any of the oldest oral histories, if anyone talked about that kind of diaspora and the experiences of Malayalam speakers in Kerala.
Thank you. That is a great question. And yes, so my grandmother went to a convent school, like in what was the Madras Presidency, and she also says the Queen's English is one of her languages. That's like, anyway. She has really interesting language ideologies. She's always correcting my English, which I love. But so absolutely that. So just as like a broad point, like length of time is something that like just in every context, that's going to make a difference with how that word is going to be treated or seen or how it's used. One thing that's sort of, there's so many ways to answer this. Okay, I'll give you one example, and then I'll talk about one other thing. So one thing that that is really relevant here is this experience with these other languages and how when you have so let's say we can think of really simple examples in English, right? So like there's all these words in English that are from other languages, and that's not always transparent to us. But then sometimes there's always the person who went to Paris for a week and says croissant now, right? So there's like this sort of like joke way of thinking about that. But that's also a really real phenomenon of like the more we know something about another language or have experience with it, then we have the opportunity to notice that we have English origin words or other origin words in the language that we're using, right? So that's really an important mechanism here of that as well, that sort of changing of awareness. And so one thing that has happened, so I have all these examples of changes in the same word. So like the word for pen, right? So like older ones would be like, well, okay, pen is a bad example because it also could be Portuguese. Let me think of a better one. glass is one. So there's like, there's data on that from like the 50s. And people would say things like kilasa or klasa or something like that, which that sort of more follows the patterns of Malayalam, like other words in Malayalam. But now people don't say kilasa anymore, or maybe some people say klasa, but a lot of people say glasa, right? They say the g at the beginning. There's other things that are like that, and so what we have is, in some cases, reborrowings. So like a word that was sort of already there, and then people are like, oh wait, that's English. Like I know how to say that in a different way. And so we have these sort of like doublets of not just like a Malayalam origin word and an English origin word, but two English origin words that have been borrowed at different time frames and are treated differently. And there's a lot of, all I have done is sort of note those, but there's like a lot of things that left to be explored about, like, do people treat them differently? Like, who does that? Where is that happening, right? There's like sort of a lot of interesting things to say about that, yeah. So that's one point. And then the other point really is about this, this like what happened even earlier. And so, like the type of, language use situation that you were talking about, the convent schools, we were talking about in this case as well. We do those earliest folks that came, like some of them really did have that type of experience. So a lot of the really earliest folks that came, so the Christian community was a majority of the Malayali community at the beginning. Now that's not the case. And the folks that were there, so there's in our group sisters, so like nuns that were brought, so there was like a lack of nuns in North America, a big crisis. So people would bring nuns in from Kerala, and also one of the people was a founding member, and he passed away right after I talked to him. I feel so grateful I got to talk to him. Came here to go to Bible school, and was a minister at the University of Minnesota for a long time. And his experience also with English really mirrors with Malayalam and English really mirrors what you're talking about. And the way that these folks are using English, completely different. And it really is something that you guys who are Malayalis can probably know, when you hear somebody with that background using that type of English, you can really categorize, oh, I know who you are and where you grew up because of the use of your English. And that is something that we really see big differences now, right? We don't see that variety of English is not really present anymore. And not anymore, and those elders are using it, but in the younger folks are not speaking English in that way, yeah. And then there's also the thing of some people also shifting to more Minnesotan sounding, right? So they'll have yeah. So my dad talks about he was looking for jobs, and he was I learned he was looking at the yellow pages, and by the time he got to E, he realized he should start saying job instead of job with I don't even have that vowel because I'm so Minnesotan, I can't even say it, but anyway. So yeah, that's also a thing that's really relevant too, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So is there any sense of prescriptivism with correct Malayalam use? So let's say, to the people in the diaspora, is it something where linguistic changes, or they kind of look for approval, say, well, people in Kerala speak that way, it's okay? Or is there a sense of coolness in the diaspora, so the people in the diaspora are saying it, that's cool, so it's, I don't know. Is there any sense of, because if there's less linguistic divergence, which technology, could facilitate, like you talked about, is there a sense of who's following whom?
Right.
Or do you get any sense of that?
No. Okay, so this is an empirical question that we can look at in this data set a little bit, but also a lot of people have a lot of opinions about it, which is the part that I can say. So people in Kerala will be oh, it's because of all these non-resident Indians are ruining the language. They're coming. So all these people who are very mobile, that's why there's so much English being used, right? So everyone's blaming each other. Then people in Minnesota are no one really speaks just Malayalam anymore. When I go back, they're using more English than I do. I don't even understand what they're saying sometimes. Or so there's a little bit of that. There's also more positive attitudes as well. So there is this sense of everybody is sort of keyed into what everybody else is doing, and there's an idea of there's difference there. But the coolness factor because we didn't talk to as many young people about language stuff in that way, that's something that we sort of are going to get a little bit of this like larger survey that has a lot like third generation folks as well. But the thing that came up there was more like, oh yeah, we like just talk about movies like with our cousins, like just like I would talk about movies with like my friends here, right? So it's like participating in pop culture together, like sharing memes, like so having similar slang. So like there is like convergence there. But as for who is copying whom, I don't have a like full sense of that. And obviously I'm sure it's something that really varies across community or like sort of at really like micro levels. But that's such a good question because like coolness is a mechanism of language change, right? Like it's very important.
So is authenticity.
Yeah,
You
and
can
so is
imagine people in the
authenticity.
diaspora saying, oh, we need to be authentic, so
Right.
whatever, you know, to
So-
nuts with all that, I'm going to find whatever they
Yes.
imagine is authentic.
Exactly, and actually that is, so yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that again, because that is also something that comes up, especially in the earlier group, right, who didn't have as much connection. So like, you know, I'll give you an example from my own life, like I was forbidden to use English at home. So like I sound really weird for lots of reasons. That's like normal with you know, folks that grew up in the United States or like diaspora communities. Like you might, you know, I grew up with my grandma, I sound like more like my grandma, right? So I sort of talk like an old person when I go to India, there's that. But also I sound weird because I use too much Malayalam, like for certain words. Like, and that's because there was this sort of like purism ideology that like was not present. And there's that type of thing is also present in other cultural practices as well. So we see in diaspora communities across the board in many ways, more like conservatism. And there's conservatism because of you're sort of frozen from like when you left. You think that's what's going on in India still when it's like really not. It's because you're like out of touch, right? There's that aspect. It's also because who is coming to the US is of certain social and like, you know, like and economic groups that might be more conservative in other ways as well. Like, and it's also, yeah, this sort of idea of we want to preserve like something. So those are, I was really thinking I would see more of that actually. That was like one thing that motivated this. Yeah, this sort of perceived difference between the two groups. And it's there for sure, yeah.
I was going to follow up on that in terms of a purism ideology that you mentioned. Do you think there's any possibility, though, that some of the languages will revert to eliminating some English at some point, or do you think it's too far beyond that? I'm thinking more of Tamil, which
right.
is more traditional in a lot of ways, and there may be some efforts to say we must stick to a purer form of the language.
Yes, I love that there's a lot of work on this in Tamil because it's such a good comparison with Malayalam. Where like we just don't see that. Like people will say, oh yeah, we need to go to a pure Malayalam or whatever. That's like the huge minority, like in terms of like ideology, and like that's like scoffed at. It's also like you know, people really are proud in Kerala of like we like all languages. Like we love speaking different languages. We're like good at like, you know, that's really like a thing that people are proud of, like how heterogeneous their language is and language practices are. And some people even compare that to Tamil, like not like them, like they're so pure, like you can't even read Tamil, it's like so hard to understand, blah, 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 but like we, you know, so there is that idea there for sure, and I'd be really surprised if that happened. I think a lot of things would have to change for that idea, like for that to happen. I just can't see it, and even like, you know, yeah, I mean, what would that mean? Like, what would that look like? It probably would be something that would have some English origin words just because some of them are not really transparent. But wow, yeah, I just can't even imagine it. But that'd be a fun question to ask people, I think. I wonder what people would say. I think that people would be like, hell no, yeah. I don't know what you guys think. Yeah.
So I lived in Kerala till 2002. 2000 something like that. So in my place, like there is 14th district, right? So 14th district people have different slangs in Malayalam, and they conflict each other, and you know which language is like authentic kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
There is a conflict in between us two, right? If
Yes.
I go to North Kerala, they will laugh at me the way
Yes.
I speak. So like we are talking about the American Malayalees and you know Malayalees, but there is a lot of things happening there too.
Yeah, and there is, so actually one thing I should have said is like that 1977 paper, that that fieldwork took place where a lot of people say is like the pure Malayalam or the best, most like purest one, which is Valluvernada. So that people think that that's where like the good Malayalam is or whatever. Like people mention that to me, but there's also other, I mean, there's also other ideologies at play, right? So it's like some people think that's the one that's like the least mixed, and that's what's pure. Other people think, no, it's the one that's more like the written language, that's more pure. And everyone thinks that their own is better. There's, you know, so there's like a lot of different, there's so much linguistic diversity that like you were mentioning, like, yeah, there's a lot of competing ideologies there.
You won't even understand when I go to North Kerala, right? You won't understand their Malayalam, like it's, you know,
Yeah.
you can't really follow. They talk differently.
So I gave a talk about this in Kerala a few months ago, and you know, somebody said something that was a really great way of thinking about it too, which is like really how we think about language as linguists. It's like, right, there is no such thing as one Malayalam, of course, right? I'm talking about it that way as like a label, but that's, you know, that's not what language is. Like there's no boundaries or limits on that. What really there is there's ways of speaking that we do in our own communities, and then, you know, sort of then that like sort of, what do you call it, gets abstracted up, and then someone can put a label on it, but like it's not, that's not a real analytic object. And so that's also something that I think is, yeah, is sort of important to remember, that like, you know, from the sort of linguistic perspective, that's like, it is an ideology to say that, yeah.
I have a question, one kind of clarification question, then
Yeah.
a follow-up. But when you say they were against bilingualism, or this first generation,
Yeah.
what did you mean by that actually? Because were they like against mixing, or were they against knowing both languages separately, or what?
Knowing both languages separately, in many cases. So people really reported, you know, so it looked different for different people in those, yeah, in those sort of like that, in that early cohort. For some people it was really like, you know, anxiety because of being so minoritized and like so like there's very few people like us here, wanting to make sure that your kids like fit in and like don't sound weird and like know English. And so that is like this, that's one way of like assimilationism, like for protection or things like that. That was one type of thing that was talked about. And the other thing was also this sort of top-down ideology that was really, still is pervasive for lots of racialized multilinguals, right, to this day, of if you're bilingual, then you won't know either language, or it'd be really hard for you to learn English, right? Which is like wrong, but it gets told to Spanish English bilinguals every day. And it, you know, and like I said, it's something that like teachers would say to my parents when I was a kid. So it's like very, like there is that thing of, and you know, my mom was just like angry about that and was like, no, but like a lot of people were like, oh yeah, like we should do that, right? So like there is that as well, like that's one part of it. And then the other thing with the sort of more recent generation, so part of it is like not having some of those like external anxieties, like feeling they're not worried as much about, they're not worried about their kids' English, right? So they're like, this is gonna be fine, I'm worried about their Malayalam actually. So there's like that aspect of it. And then there's also these sort of like older second gen people who aren't speaking the language that they knew from like when they were growing up, and people would come and visit and like not speak Malayalam when they came to Kerala or whatever, right? So like they had this sort of experience from before, and they're like, oh, I don't want my kids to be like that. So there's also that cause, yeah, so there's differences in the top-down ideologies. There's fewer people saying to, especially like South Asian Americans, right? Even though they are saying it to, Spanish-speaking people in the United States, they're not saying as much to South Asian Americans that they shouldn't speak this other language, and that's because of discrimination.
Let me ask you about that though, as it relates. So you talk about competing linguistic ideologies, but you're also telling a story of language ideology contact and how they're these different things. And I wonder if you could say more about the kind of almost like a classic South Asia language ideology, which is pervasive. You find, I remember one of my first kind of most intriguing experiences when I was very young in college, and I was in Varanasi, and I met this friend, and we went home, and he started speaking some of their language in Varanasi, and we've been talking Hindi and a little bit of English. And I said, well, what are you doing here? He said, oh, that's Bengali. And I said, well, I thought you guys were from here. And he said, yeah, we've been here for 7 or 8 generations.
Right.
And they're still speaking Bengali. And of course, this is all around. You can find immigrant groups that
Yes.
have been living there for 600 years or
Yes.
400 years and still speaking the language. So it's really fascinating to me that from that background, that the people you're talking about who come from India were so overwhelmed by the language ideology of the U.S., the assimilationist language ideology, rather than just assuming like they knew everyone's bilingual. So
Right.
so why wouldn't they just say this? These Americans are. I mean, obviously there's power in it, but
Right.
I'm just so amazed that the power of that people didn't just say like, oh, of course we can learn. Like tell the doctor's an idiot.
Right.
Because the doctor grew up in a monolingual
Right.
thing, just didn't know better.
Right,
But
right,
why do you? I mean, it's more of a wonder, I guess. I don't know
Yeah.
if there's a real answer to it, but it's such a powerful openness to multilingualism in South
Right.
Asia, and then immediately people are worried about their kids not learning English. I mean, that doesn't track with the experience of language that anyone would have in South Asia.
Right, right. No, that's a really good point. And I do think I shouldn't say that like people were just like unthinkingly like, oh, the doctor said it, so I must not. I think it's like that's one factor, right? It's like one voice that like made it less likely for somebody to like do the really like annoying and like not fun work of like forcing your kid to speak this like minority language at home. So I think like there's also that of like it's not easy to actually do this, which like I'm knowing now with like a little kid, right? So it is not like actually easy to like put this into practice. And I think that like I think so some of it is like the experience, also the experiences of those kids themselves is really important too, right? That's the other difference is like it's not really the parents all the time being the one to like sort of say this. It's also the kid, what the kids experience in school and what that was like as well. And it's not just, you know, more South Asians, it's also more multilinguals in Minnesota, right? Like this would not look the same, I wouldn't think, in like if these kids were growing up in New York City, right? Where like that's way more ubiquitous. Like I don't think I knew very many people who spoke another language at home when I was like in elementary school. Like that was not common, depending on where people lived. So I think that that's also part of, I mean, I think it's a really important, crucial part. Like I talked about this sort of top-down ideology, but it is also how those individual kids were, like, it's like you have to have more stick-to-itiveness in many ways to like overcome some of these things when you're in a situation where you're like one of very few or the only one or something. And I do think, we really can't overstate the thing of the people who came later being like, oh, I don't want it to be like them. They would say that too, yeah. And also the older folks, really expressing regret, like that they wish they had done more to like do it, right? But they're like, oh, I was working as a nurse for 80 hours a week. Like I couldn't, I mean, there's also that, like the class aspect of it is also really important too. Like people, it takes a different type of, it takes something to do that, yeah.
I'm really interested in the kind of emergence of a sort of pan-Desi identity among second generation Malayalees. And I just wanted to kind of know if you could go more into that about how Malayali speakers kind of either resisted or aligned, how they sort of resisted, like what strategies did they employ, or how they sort of expressed solidarity and comfortability with that particular label of Desi or something.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is another thing that really motivated this because, like, it really is something that I would say, like, folks who are in their 20s now and younger, like, that's who is, like, part of that. And it's, like, not anybody older than that. Like, so it's like it feels like a big, like, discontinuity there. It's definitely something I personally do not identify with, and, like, it feels strange to me. So I feel very outsider to that, like, in my own experience. Okay, so different things that came up about that. So, and again, like when we really dig into this, this big survey, there's gonna be a lot more to say. I'm like super excited about that. But in the interviews, the different things that came up are first, like sort of, like youth organizations, like where you're interacting with folks from like other South Asian like situations, or like participation like Bhangra, or like dance team, like other types of like sort of like events like that are really not about being Malayali, really. It's something that's like more generally defined. that's like ways that people participate in that. We also see it in like dating preferences and patterns, right? So this is where we have this homogenization of people, like parents' preferences and kids' preferences of like, oh, well, it counts if it's someone who's like in maybe my same religion or my same caste, but it doesn't have to be Malayali, it's just Indian is enough. So there's also that, right? So that's like the sort of homogenization, like that's good enough for this, that will count. So that, you know, gets at like how people are like delineating things. And then ways of sort, and also, yeah, things like, and also who they are interacting with and who they're friends with too, right? So like this idea of like, you know, yeah, I have like my South Asian friends, like my Deshi friends, and we like have like Desi memes, and we're on like the subtle curry traits Reddit or whatever. Like there's like all this like stuff like around it. There's all these spaces around that as well that people can participate in or not. And then the resistance looks like more the ways that that came up. So some of it's like we found it a little bit in this word choice things of like, well, I would never say doll. That's not my word, like spudba, like, or, you know, whatever. And I have that strongly in my own thing. So I will say that, like, I will, you know, what do you call it, convey my positionality there. But the other thing really is also, especially with Malayali Christians, right? So it's really resisting these ideas of from the like Anglo gaze of like what it means to be Indian, or like, you know, really like identifying with being a meat eater and like, you know, like things like that, or like the different types of foods that people really want to like identify with. That's like one way where they're like, this is my Malayali food. It's not like, you know, not like a butter chicken, right? So it's like really resisting that stuff, like the homogenized stuff, and going towards specificity. And yeah, so it's more like it came out more in like these sort of interpersonal interactions of like, I always had to be like, yeah, my name is Christina, but yes, I'm, you know, whatever. Yes, I'm Indian, right? Like, or all these things, right? So it's that type of thing of having to sort of push against these, yeah, hegemonic ideas. Yeah, that doesn't like, yeah, anyway, there's a lot there. It's like so interesting. I don't even know. Yeah, it's really cool.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you all for
Thank
coming,
you so
and
much.
thank you so much again for wonderful.
Thank you.